Hello, everyone. This is once again an interview that I'm going to have with a very distinguished guest on collecting vintage watches. Specifically, we are going to parse the difference between what are true vintage icons and perhaps what are hype watches, to use the most recognizable term. Once again, I have the pleasure of welcoming Eric Wind, who, of course, established his own company, Wind Vintage, in 2017, based out of Palm Beach, Florida. Before that, he was the vice president and senior specialist at Christie's, of course, one of the most respectable names on this side of the Atlantic, if you ask me. Some of you would know him from his work at Christie's, his own experience as a true passionate and driven addict of vintage watches, really. Some of you would know him perhaps from his collaborations with Seiko and with Jack Carlson's Rowing Blazers as well. Again, designing a number of different watches. And others would know him from his pieces at Hodinkee and the reference points videos that he did with them on some true icons from Rolex's catalog, namely 5513 and 1016, the 4-digit Submariner and the 4-digit Explorer. So once again, Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on again. It's an honor. I got a lot of great feedback from our last show, so it's wonderful to be back.
Thank you. People have already had heaps of respect for you, but the fact that you were so generous with your time for our community and so patiently answered all of my questions and all of their questions, I've gotten a lot of great feedback too, and it's truly an honor to welcome you back.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So I guess we should probably start with the definition of a hype watch, if that's where you want to start.
Yes, I was thinking about a few things. One of the members of my audience passed on to me this article from last year by a Collected Man, which was talking about how the watch industry responds to crises. And we might well be in the middle of a moment of crisis once again. But one of the points that they highlighted was how, from perhaps taking certain kinds of horological adventures, a lot of times the iconic brands start tapping into their own archives and start coming up with reiterations and reinterpretations of their own icons, their own vintage collectibles. And this made me think about what is really like a transactional, say, dialectic relationship between some of the modern hype watches and vintage icons, right? There's a sense that the minute that a certain exhaustion seems to be felt in the industry for financial reasons or otherwise, there seems to be a turn towards lasting value and the watches that represent that. On the other hand, of course, whenever the industry seems to come up with certain iterations and reinterpretations of their iconic models, there seems to be a resurgence of interest in the vintage versions, in the original versions of those models too. How do you think is the watch industry responding to the perceived crisis at this moment? And do you think we can already see a semblance of a similar turn toward iconic designs?
I think we're definitely seeing the iconic designs doing extremely well. And I think there is a couple approaches. One is to go back to the original and make almost exact reissues of the original watch, which we saw with Vacheron Constantin and their 222. If I just looked at a photo of the gold one versus a vintage one, I probably couldn't see a difference. Whereas it's obvious with like an Audemars Piguet 16202 or 15202 versus the 5402, just different fonts, and you can just tell the dial's a little bit different.
And the
So
date window, of course.
date window, of course, yeah. So um, the there's that approach which Vacheron did. Obviously, essentially a 1-to-1 reissue of the one in black in gold. I mean, and then there is kind of taking an iconic model and reinterpreting it in a new way with new materials, which AP has done with their perpetual calendars in ceramic. Of course, they did black originally, then they did white ceramic, which reminds me a bit of like a Chanel watch, but it is Trevor Noah's been seen wearing it. And now for Geneva Watch Days, they just did it in blue. It almost looks like kind of the moon swatch Neptune, like the blue bioceramic, or people were
Right.
calling it a blue Lego, which I kind
Some
of,
called it some called it Smurf blue. I think it's
yeah,
more like a French blue, but yeah, it is. It is an
yeah,
interesting shade.
yeah. And I think, personally, I think it's kind of a cool looking watch, and almost like it's here. It kind of looks like a toy. People are like, "Oh, it looks like a G-Shock or something," but it's a very expensive uh, example of high watchmaking, and no compromises on the movement, dial, hands, etc. Obviously, no compromises on any part of the watch, but you just see someone, if you don't know watches, wearing that, and you think they're wearing like a swatch or something interesting until you get closer. So maybe that is to help protect people from getting their
Mhm.
watches robbed in Paris or London. But because from a distance, the person on the scooter might think it's just a swatch. But that is that there's, yeah, both those ways to interpret it. Obviously, the watch industry has had an unprecedented boom the last 2 years, where companies are literally trying to operate 24/7 if they have enough watchmakers and materials to make watches. And
Mhm.
they still are only meeting a small fraction of the demand. So um, that's that's good. The negative, I would say, the peak of the watch market, as we would say, the modern watch market for me is January, February 2022. And since then, a lot of the models on the secondary market are literally half of what they were, 8
Mm.
months ago. So those are still numbers that are above retail numbers. Thankfully for the watch manufacturers, they have no issue selling watches, but it is a significant change.
I think you hit on two very interesting points, which I will use actually to elaborate what I tried to say at the beginning. Um, One is, of course, you did mention that from that high point of the hype, let's say, and we will unpack that word as well. Some watches have already halved in terms of the price point, but not the entire. The entire market has not been affected in the same way. And I know from your interactions and interviews and some of the remarks that you have shared with the media in the last few months that you still have a certain confidence in the market for vintage watches and for in the market for the classics. Can you tell me a little more about the source of that confidence?
Well, I guess a few things. First, you can call me old fashioned, but I personally can't envision paying, 10 times retail price for a watch that's a current production model, if I was putting my collector hat on. Um,
Old
and
fashioned, old fashioned is a compliment on this
Yeah,
platform.
yeah,
So.
exactly. So, you know, it is just anathema to my Wisconsin upbringing if I was buying something to keep to, want to spend 10 times literally the retail price for something current model. So it's no surprise. I mean, current production models are coming down in value because they're still being produced literally as fast as the watchmakers can do it. If you take the steel Daytona with white dial, 116500 LN. I have one. It's my only modern Rolex in my collection. I got it at retail, thankfully. The one that was used sold in May at Christie's for 70,000, and it's retail roughly $13,000. So absolutely insane and really silly. But I am an enthusiast. I love the watch. I plan to pass it down to one of my kids one day. It's not something I ever plan to sell. Even if someone offered me $100,000 for it, I guess you could sell it and then go buy another. But I guess that's what I would do. But the issue I would say for most watches is they are out of production. They're a scarce resource, particularly vintage watches, which, as you know, is sort of my passion and enthusiasm. So these are not being made in great numbers, and when you become a collector and begin looking for top quality, you realize how difficult it is to find something in original, untouched condition. It's like only a few examples may come up per year, and the criteria that would fit your desires in terms of originality. And that's, we're a population approaching 8 billion people, and I might see 4 or 5 really nice Paul Newmans come up for sale per year, vintage Daytonas with a Paul Newman dial. So as a result, I actually think some of those things are undervalued because, lots of people know what a Paul Newman Daytona is. If they had the resources and desire, it'd still be very, very hard to find a good one. So that is part of why I'm bullish too. I think we've seen the field of watches kind of lag behind the fields of art and cars by some years. Some say a decade, some say two, maybe a decade behind cars, 2 decades behind art. So if you look at where those markets are today, both in terms of the sophistication of collectors, the financial tools even that allow you to borrow against your collection or lease back your collection, or all kinds of interesting things that most vintage car owners now are leasing basically their own cars back so they don't have to have the money out for it. And obviously many art collectors lend against their art collections like they're lending against their stock portfolio. They're able to essentially make financial instruments of their collections. So we're not there at all with watches, which is a positive because it means values are more stable. There are, these things are still a fraction of the cost of other things. The positive with watches are they're very portable. The upkeep is very limited compared to, cars. It's not easy to move a car around the world. So you can't like pop it in a bag or on your wrist and fly, across the ocean. They're very easy to store. They don't really degrade if you have it in good condition in a safe place. Whereas cars can, if you're just letting it sit, it's not going to be great for the car for a couple of years. So yeah.
So the other thing that I wanted to underline in the 2 examples that you brought up for vintage inspired modern releases, of course, especially in the case of the Royal Oak, whether we are talking about the jumbo extra thin or a version, an iteration of their perpetual calendars that is somehow both a hype watch and an icon. And I think that's an interesting example to bring up, and perhaps to try to disentangle for us together, because like you said, sometimes certain watches, certain wristwatches are collectible purely because of the limited numbers. And when it comes to the vintage market, this has always been the case, and it's increasingly the case, especially when it comes to that particular segment that you highlighted, where you are looking for top condition, unmolested, if not unpolished. What makes a watch so desirable, to be so excessively in demand, in your opinion, beyond the limited numbers? Because the Daytona, for example, of course, it is still an instance of the demand outpacing by multiple times the supply, but it's not exactly a limited production watch. Like you said, it is still in production in the same iteration, and perhaps in one of the most desired models with the ceramic bezel in stainless steel. What is the what is the difference about a watch like the Daytona? What makes it so desirable?
There's something called mimetic desires, I believe. So it's where people want what everyone else wants, and that's just the natural aspect of humanity. There's a few scholars that have focused on that in academia, but essentially, the Daytona is a classic example of something that was not very desirable back in the day becoming desirable over a period of time for a number of reasons. You can't say it's just one, but as you probably have heard, it's like a common kind of lore. It was very difficult to sell Daytonas in the 70s and particularly 80s. By the time the 1980s rolled around, no one wanted manual wind watches anymore. So the person that was going in to buy a Daytona reference 6263 or 6265 was very unusual. And sometimes I've heard of those watches being discounted like 80%. Literally, the retailer selling them at a loss to try to get them off their books because they had sat in the store for like 2 years, 3 years. And then Paul Newman's were not really very desirable on the secondary market in the 80s through the early 90s. Then basically people found the photo of Paul Newman wearing it, some of his iconic photos, got a nickname. Collectors, sort of the birthplace of vintage watch collecting is Italy. They began thinking they're cool, gave them a nickname. Then in Japan, they were in Asia, they were getting excited about them. Then it kind of took off. That's on the vintage side. And on the modern side, the Zenith Daytona kind of began taking off in the mid 90s. More and more people were liking it. That's when we saw the first kind of wait lists ever for a Daytona. Became harder to get them. In fact, at that time, the Explorer reference 14270 was even harder to get than the Daytona because some Japanese TV stars were wearing them. So suddenly all of Japan wanted the 14270. And dealers would essentially try to bundle up as many as they could, then fly to Japan and sell them all in like 2 hours at a watch show. I've heard of some of these dealers telling me about that. But that is, it all starts when people begin to want something, and then it begins rolling from there. So the Nautilus is a kind of classic story, I would say. More recently, not that easy of a watch to sell. I remember I was offered one at retail 2015. It was 26,000. They were selling around 28,000 on the secondary market, but not like crazy. 5711 steel blue dial. I didn't want to buy it from the retailer and flip it. And quite honestly, I prefer the 3700 because it's much thinner and no seconds hand and just a more elegant watch. If you put the two next to each other, there's no comparison in my view. That the 3700 is a lot nicer. And that was kind of similar money, just a little bit more expensive at that time. So I passed suddenly, and we at Christie's did an auction called the Nautilus 40 in late 2016. We did 10.
I was gonna say, you're talking about it in almost an impersonal way, but that's still the time when you were at Christie's, where
Yeah.
the 50th
So
anniversary.
the
Sorry,
Nautilus
40th.
was
40th
beginning to
anniversary.
the Nautilus was beginning to get some interest. Exactly 40th anniversary. We said, why don't we do a thematic auction, but for the first time do 10 in each of our sale locations rather than 40 in one, because I think the demand just isn't there, and there aren't that many different references. You can't have 4 3700s in the same auction. They'll do very badly. So we did 10 in Hong Kong, 10 in Dubai, 10 in Geneva, and 10 in New York. And as the auctions were rolling through, it was really becoming a grind to sell them, in a sense. Like, there were not tons of people wanting to buy them. So you had to work hard to sell them. Like, you've got to contact people, encourage them to bid, go out and essentially, text, call, email clients who you think might want to buy them and kind of cajole them into bidding. Hopefully they did, because they would be rewarded with increased values now, which is the case for some. But then basically we saw the Nautilus begin to be talked about in rap videos. Suddenly it's like more everywhere in culture. People didn't know what they were before. It was sort of a very niche, more watch community watch. Then it just kind of just kept spiraling. And now it's one of the most recognizable watches on the planet, of course. The Tiffany 5711 took it to another level, which I think actually may have hurt the model, because now a bunch of people that had 5711s basically decided to sell them because they thought it attracted the wrong kind of attention from when they bought it new. Obviously, it's worth a lot more than before, but it kind of has jumped the shark. It's kind of gone beyond peak hype, and may have hurt the brand, or may have hurt the model, I should say, a little bit.
So we have basically talked about three models of watches now, like the Rolex Daytona, like the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, and like Patek Philippe Nautilus, who are now recognizably hype watches, in addition to being also certain kinds of icons, even if the interest after those 40th anniversaries especially have skyrocketed in a certain way. Do you have in your mind examples of underrated and undervalued vintage classics, both in the way of a brand and in the way of specific models, where you think that they offer something that's very appealing, but that the market has not necessarily caught up with that appeal just yet?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great buys, I think, in the world of watches, things that are undervalued. I'll name just a few that I like a lot, but one would be vintage Vulcain crickets. My colleague Charlie Dunn and I are very extensive collections of these we've developed over the years, but they have kind of everything you would look for in a great vintage watch. An interesting complication, the alarm. Took about a decade for them to develop it in that sort of size where it could be loud enough to wake you up. A variety of interesting cases, different case shapes, from the very earliest kind of watches with the LBJ dials to the 70s, when they had a lot of really interesting, funky larger case shapes. I've got one on my wrist right now from the 70s. And
Can we see
then,
that again?
oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Very nice. Very
This
nice.
is, yeah, this is an S2325B with a gray dial. Super cool shape. Then you've got interesting marketing from that period. You have a nickname that it's the President's Watch because you had all these presidents wear it. Truman, Eisenhower, LBJ, all the presidents kind of owned Nixon. All the presidents kind of owned it essentially, but obviously not all of them wore it. But for some of them, they really relied on it. Very interesting technological advancement where people were literally setting aside their Patek Philippe watches in the late 40s in favor of the Vulcan cricket because it was so useful for them. Traveling, yeah, very appropriate question. Just a great presidential history. Even Gorbachev wore one, is seen on the cover of Time magazine wearing one. And these are watches that are still the vast majority under $3,000. So that is one kind of very undervalued watch. It's really about finding the right cricket in the right condition. A lot of them are very worn. Obviously, you want it running well, etc. So like anything, they're not rare, but they are rare to find in good condition. So that's one. Two, vintage Jaeger LeCoultre watches, I think, are a classic. Particularly a lot of their time onlys, some with power wind, kind of power reserves. They call it the power wind or Futurematic models. A whole variety of interesting dive watches, kind of technical watches, chronographs, etc. My colleague Charlie Dunn as well, and I are big vintage Jaeger LeCoultre collectors, fans. We also collect the clocks. Yeah, that's a great one. Probably a U.S. case. Very interesting, funky watches. Also, many are in rough condition with reprinted dials. Lots of patina, etc. So again, it's about finding the right watch because it's not rare per se as a watch, but finding the right one in the right condition is rare. So that is a great sort of area as well. That's relatively undiscovered. Prices are not extremely high. The vintage Memovox is obviously a very similar watch to the cricket and fantastic complication with the alarm. Very actually useful, beautiful. I love how the two crowns are on the right side of the case. Just gorgeous watches. And then we could talk about a lot more, but even vintage Omega time only watches, Seamasters, Constellations, also often under $3,000. Literally could be your one watch you wear every day, the rest of your life, and be happy. Wear it at any sort of occasions, and always a very classy and elegant watch. Then if you're going up in value slightly, in my opinion, there are two watches everyone should probably have in their collection at some point, and I generally hate these proscription sort of things that people say, but vintage Datejust, I think everyone should own at some point or have in their collection. I've gotten more into them as I've gone on with time. Of course, when I first got interested in Rolex, it was Submariners, GMT Masters, Daytonas, but there's just something magical about a great Datejust. And then Omega Speedmasters as well. Arguably the best chronograph ever made. One of the most important watches ever made because of their space history, and a lot to delve into on the collecting side.
And again, even the more common predictable examples you gave, especially when it comes to, let's say, a 4-digit Datejust or say pre-moon Omega Speedmaster, on the one hand, there are great deals to be had still. On the other hand, they are getting increasingly more difficult to find in good condition because those are, in a way, within that panorama of icons, very specific niche interests, right? You know, a pre-moon Speedmaster is something that only an enthusiast would follow and try to dig up. Maybe a little different after the 321 caliber was brought back by Omega. Now maybe there will be a renewed and different kind of interest in Speedmasters with that caliber, but they're already very difficult to find because they are usually snapped by enthusiasts who buy them to wear them, who buy them to collect them, and who are not really getting rid of them anytime soon.
Definitely. Yeah. Very hard to find great condition Speedmasters. Obviously, many are overpolished or replaced parts. One sort of other thing to consider is these great Speedmasters with 321 movements from the 60s are literally less expensive than the brand new Omegas with 321 movements on the secondary market.
Mhm.
And I would rather have the vintage model from the 60s. It's what the astronauts wore. So tremendous value there, and just tremendous. It's a tremendous movement. And it's really also one of those watches that you can wear anywhere, and is just a fantastic piece.
It really is. I mean, it's also there's something quite romantic about contemplating hand wound chronograph movement, right? Like what you were talking about the 80s and no one really wanting hand wound chronograph at the time. And the more the automatic chronographs really took over the space, the more people like us who are, you know, old heads or old fashioned started, I think, pining for um, a, a manual chronograph movement with good architecture. And really, when it comes to those classics, iterations of Lemania 2310 or CH27 are really still one of the most beautiful. You know, you can geek out about how different brands have assembled and decorated it, and the different shapes of bridges, you know, from Omega to Patek Philippe to Vacheron Constantin to Lemania's own chronographs. Sometimes I was
Yeah.
in a recent show, I was bringing up this Lemania 2320 from roughly around 1957, which has the broad arrow hands. I don't know if you have seen something like this. You probably have, but for us, it was a very interesting discovery. Let me pull it up again. There we go. And it's really a fascinating little piece.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
not
with
one
the,
I've seen. I've not seen that before, so I would do some more research about that model. But it's interesting.
but you see, I mean, just the um, shot of the case back with
One of the
the
best events ever. Just spectacular. It really is a beautiful thing, and they essentially have used that, in the Patek Philippe chronographs with the Lemania movements. It's really like an iteration of this movement, just with finer finishing. That was
Mhm.
in the 3970, 5970, 5070. So yeah, it's just a fantastic, fantastic movement.
So now I'm actually going to ask you about a specific brand and something that I think you also played a part in bringing up to wider public attention. You know, when Hodinky was first taking off, we used to joke around among friends about the Hodinky tax. You know, whatever you guys would bring up would suddenly take on a certain kind of premium in the market. And some of them proved to be a little more ephemeral, perhaps, but others quite long lasting. And I think Universal is one of those brands that really came to wider public attention, really through Hodinkee and through the work of people uh, like you. What can you say about Universal and the way it was, I guess, softly hyped, but still retains value, both in the sense of having a number of iconic models, but also presenting a certain uh, financial value in and worth in the vintage collectors market?
Yeah, so I think one of those pivotal moments that helped UG was the sale of the Henry Graves Jr. Pete Fullerton collection at Sotheby's. I want to say in 2012. Um, Among Pete Fullerton's watches, beyond a few unique Patek Philippe watches he had inherited from Henry Graves Jr., including a perpetual calendar, etc. But um, and a platinum rectangular watch I absolutely love was a Universal Geneve Tri-Compax. That was sort of his first watch purchase from the 1940s. And he had shown Henry Graves Jr., who approved of the watch. It was a watch that also came through Henry Stern Watch Agency in New York, which is Patek Philippe's US branch distributor. So there was this connection between this connection between UG and Patek Philippe, even at that time, and mutual respect. Like UG was kind of the little brother, kind of like Rolex and Tudor today, except not owned, of course, the same way like they were, but somewhat analogous. So um, this watch Ben purchased, he wrote that article that you pulled up on Hodinkee. That was his first UG, I believe. It was kind of one of the first watches he bought at auction, I believe. It had that original Patek Philippe strap, which is awesome.
Right.
He now wears it on a tan vintage strap, which was seen on John Goldberger's Instagram a few days ago, if you look it up, on his wrist. But this was sort of a love letter to UG, his first step into this.
Wait,
And
one second. Does that imply changing of hands or just a wrist shot?
no, just a wrist shot. Ben wore it to Switzerland. Goldberger wanted to buy it actually at the time. He said basically, man, I should have bought that after Ben did, and offered to buy it. Thankfully, Ben said no. Otherwise, UG collecting might not be where it is today. But yeah, Ben, that was his first entry point. He has, one of the best UG collections in the world. Lots of rare, interesting chronographs. And you can run the gamut with UG from these very interesting 1930s chronographs through the very cool 1960s chronographs, like the Eric Clapton Tri-Compax I had recently that we discussed.
Right. And that's the I mean, before I want to say something about Goldberger, because the Goldberger effect is a little different, since he tends to cannibalize the entire market of a certain model, and then there is a lot of interest but just no watches whatsoever. So I'm glad
Yeah.
Ben ended up keeping it. But
Yes.
I was really intrigued by what you said about the relationship between Patek Philippe and Universal. Again, not in any way an organized or commercial relationship, but in a way that the two brands reflected a certain ethos together.
And even
you,
in some U.S. publications, they had Patek Philippe and Universal Geneve next to each other in the ad, because it was through Henry Stern Watch Agency. So it was pretty amazing marketing.
yeah, and you can see it in the collections of some of the esteemed collectors, as you said. Eric Clapton would be, of course, one of those names who has a certain iteration of the Tri-Compax associated with
Yeah.
him. Yeah.
And that was the kind of that it'd be interesting. I mean, a dream would be to see an Eric Clapton talking watches one day, but to hear his philosophy, which he doesn't really share publicly, but I'd love to hear the story of how he got his tri-compacts when he was with Cream. Did he go into a store in London and happened to see it in a store window, and that was sort of the birth of his love of watches? And then obviously it went from there over the years as his financial resources increased. He was suddenly buying rare Daytonas, and he was collecting in the 90s when there was still pretty unusual. And then obviously commissioning unique Patek Philippe watches, etc. It'd be very interesting to just hear about his own watch journey.
Yeah, there he is as well. Rare photo with Hendrix wearing that.
That's great. Yeah, the Henry Stern Watch Agency, which is there, as I mentioned before, was the agent for UG in the US, which is very interesting.
Do you have? I know you recently had that Clapton tri-compacts, the Panda configuration, so to speak. Do you have any Universal Geneve in stock these days?
Yeah, if you go to the main page, I've got a Big Eye, which I think is one of the cooler pieces, 38 millimeter with the kind of this asymmetric layout. And then we just listed a, there's the Big Eye. Yeah, just above there. Then down below is our on hold. There you go. Yeah. Just also these watches had beautiful bracelets. That's a Gay Frere bracelet. Just a fantastic watch. Very, very wearable piece. And then if you go back, there's a piece kind of from the golden age as well of UG from the 40s in steel. Go down a little bit. We just put it on hold today. But it's an Aero Compacts. There you go. Look how nice that watch is. But an Aero Compacts retailed by Astrua in Torino, Turin, Italy. Very unusual to have retailer signed UGs. You see it more with Patek Philippe and Rolex from that period.
That's right.
Non-luminous, which is great. You don't have to worry about radium or lume falling off the dial or out of the hands. Just very, very clean. So yeah, I mean, there's not much more to ask for in a chronograph than that.
Again, you have in fact highlighted a few different things about Universal that really distinguishes it. That particular connection through the Sterns with Patek Philippe, the lasting passion of a lot of well-known collectors and big names in at least certain models from their catalog. And also there's something classically beautiful and balanced about their designs, even when it concerns a Big Eye, of course, because what is more classical than having a minute totalizer of a chronograph highlighted a certain way? And of course, this is a design that was recently brought back by Masena Lab in the form of the Uni Racer. And of course, Gay Frere, the bracelet company, is also known as, having invented the oyster bracelet, basically, and having made the first iteration of the Royal Oak bracelets as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct, and Patek Philippe as well for the Nautilus. Rolex owns them now, as they like to do. They buy the best stuff, and essentially anyone with a Rolex of any iteration on a bracelet is, unless it's a US made bracelet, if it's a Swiss made bracelet, it was made by Gay Frere. If you have a kind of unusual US Jubilee bracelet from the 50s through 70s, or a CNI US rivet bracelet. Those were made in the US, but for all the rest, it was really gay frere bracelets.
Amazing, amazing. Um, Once again, we have about 15 minutes, so if you don't mind, I'm gonna dip back into some of the viewer questions. I do have one more question myself, but I want to give them a little bit space. Thomas, who has been a very good friend for me, he says, "What is a good vintage era?" I think he means to try collecting from. I've recently taken to searching for the 40s watches, as I feel that's a great period when brands started to sort themselves out, he says. Do you have a favorite period yourself?
For me, if I had to pick one, I really love 1940s watches, chronographs, the early crickets. The cases are a bit crisper, kind of very interesting early attempts at waterproofing. The dials are more intricate and ornate, almost more hand drawn, if you will, all the tracks and things. So I really love 1940s watches, chronographs particularly. But I love 50s, 60s, 70s. I'd say the 50s is probably the least represented. It was a period when it was this transitional period, and there are certain watches that really stand out from that period, like the Seafarers from the 50s, the reference 2443, some of the oversized Hoyers, things like that. And obviously some Rolex sport models were really developed then. But I somehow lean more toward the 60s in general than the 50s. So maybe partially I'm not a huge fan of radium watches. They're okay, but like probably not something I would wear every single day. So
Life is short,
yeah,
and that you can take that in either direction, I think.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so I love 60s. I think 70s. Obviously, that's where we see the birth of all these watches, like the Nautilus and Royal Oak, the IWC Ingenieur, Vacheron 222, etc. So that's a very special period. But the one thing I would say for the 40s, I like your comment, Thomas, about brands sort of sorting themselves out, beginning to develop their identities, which is very true. For a lot of people, the case sizes are smaller in the 40s. Obviously, they began to get larger 50s, 60s. So some people find it difficult for the 40s watches, as I don't want to wear smaller watches.
Mm-hmm.
I am comfortable wearing kind of everything 32 millimeters and up, and sometimes even smaller than that occasionally, particularly if it's on a bracelet. But if you've got an 8-inch wrist, it might look a little silly. A 32 millimeter, small dress watch. I've seen that, before, and it generally looks a little bit odd.
I personally have no problem as well. I think every watch kind of represents a certain ethos, a certain bundle of feelings and emotions. So as long as you find the similar energy, vibe, what the young ones call it, and the right occasion, I think there's a place for everything. And of course, the market agrees as well. I mean, the Tasti Tondis as a particular kind of case design of waterproofing and of those chronographs, of course, they have come leaps and bounds, and not only in their Patek Philippe iteration, of course. My friend Dizurdis asks, have you ever handled an IDF issued Eterna or Tudor?
Yes, on the Eternas, I've had a few super cool. The Tudors are obviously much rarer. One of my colleagues from the Significant Watches podcast has one. Gabriel Benador, who also served in the IDF previously. I have not had a chance to handle it yet, but I look forward to it. He recently purchased it, so relatively new acquisition.
Just gonna share the link for significant watches as well.
Thank you. Yeah, if you are bored and interested in sort of watch talk beyond this channel, definitely check out our podcast, Significant Watches.
And of course we have taken a peek already, but as always, Eric's stock is one of the most frequently refreshed and one of the highest quality in terms of condition, especially when it comes to vintage watches. And it is pretty diverse as well. It's not just focused on one brand or one model either. So please always check out windvintage.com as well.
Thank you so much.
And I will ask my question, because when we started talking about some of the undervalued watches, you always see these sorts of overlaps with brands, models, and icons that are already remarked by the market, that are already received by the market, that already get a lot of attention. Like when it comes to iconic chronographs, of course, everyone loves by now a Rolex Daytona, an Omega Speedmaster, even though they perhaps appeal to different price segments. But not so much the Breitling Navitimer, perhaps, right? So it's, in a way, that's still undervalued. Or, when it comes to...
Yeah, super undervalued for vintage Navitimers in great condition.
Yeah, and in the same way, right, when we talk about Pilot's chronographs, for example, everyone remembers, IWCs. Everyone thinks about Breguet Type 20 and the Type 20 proper, with the Arabic numeral by the 5 main suppliers and everything. But not many think about Hoya's chronographs, for example, for Bundeswehr. Now, I gave 2 very specific examples, but would you agree that a lot of times value is in those pieces, in those models that have a shared heritage with what is already perhaps recognized and appreciated by the market, but still somehow you have these examples that are undervalued, and if you get them in good condition, with the proper, of course, enthusiasm and knowledge, they would, in long term, probably bring you a lot back, if simply the knowledge of having made the right choice.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. There's watches, when I got into collecting vintage watches, over a decade ago, that really haven't moved in value very much, even though they're fantastic. And I think the Hoyer Bundeswehr is one of those examples. You've got a very large watch, 42 millimeters, great history related to the German Air Force, not during Nazi times, thankfully, but 60s through the 80s. You've got an interesting predecessor because it kind of came from the Leonidas. So it's got an interesting kind of heritage. And their Breitling 817s very similar. And then you've got a great movement, the Valjoux 222 flyback, very distinct aluminum bezel, often the 3H in red on the dial, all these things going for it. And 10, 12 years ago, it was 5,000. Now it might be 6 to 8, 6 to 7, and not that easy to sell still. It's just one of those watches that's very, very undervalued. Great post. So that, and then you've got the Breguet Type 20 on the other hand, that for rare models can go vintage models as high as 75K. So this is such a small fraction of that. And then when you look at the Type 20s specifically, you've got obviously Breguet, but you also have J. Auricost and Airain, Dodane, and those watches also really have not moved in value the last 12 years, whereas Breguet went crazy.
And even Maté Tissot, which was the original supplier for
Yeah,
Breguet and
with
Dodin itself.
the civilian versions, those have gone up a bit because of that. But it's just it's kind of insane how much less expensive the other brands are, even for issued watches, than Breguet.
And the interesting thing with this particular watch, of course, well, thankfully, it avoids the IWC BUR kind of association with the Nazi period, produced starting with the 60s, I think mid 60s, for the Bundeswehr by Hoya. And like you said, has all the markings, all the features of a great hand-wound flyback chronograph, just like or much like the Type 20, and in a way appeals more to the modern taste because of its size, which is 42 plus, maybe a little larger even than 42, certainly larger than the Type 20s, and that it has that great balanced look of the two register, and hey, even some red writing on the dial. What else can you ask from a vintage
You're
watch?
making me want to buy one again. I had one early in my collecting journey, and I've sold a few. Now I just need to find the right one to keep.
Me too. Even though I have such a wimpy wrist, and the Type 20 sits just right on my wrist, this would be probably too big. Even then, I want one. It may well be one of my next pieces. Do you have an example? Do you have a third example, perhaps? We have touched on how Navitimer, a 60s Navitimer in good condition, is still a very good value proposition. A Hoya Bundeswehr issued chronograph has everything going on for it, much like the Type 20s and other pilots' chronos, still very much undervalued. Do you have an example that comes almost immediately to your mind?
I mean, it's kind of things we've talked about before, but Speedmasters from the 80s and 90s sometimes being under 5K is crazy. When obviously Daytonas from the 80s, are often 100K plus for a big red. Those. Yeah, I think I can't think of any other specifics of like a watch where you have a less expensive, potentially even better example of the watch. But there are plenty of things out there, no question.
I have maybe two last questions if you still have time.
Yeah.
JPCWC, I think this resonates with one of my feelings as well, so I will put it out there. A lot of dealers will list watches as patinated or with patina, while it's clearly a damaged dial, right? We had certain even terms that are coming up now that have gained a certain traction. Of course, tropical dials, spider dials. JP says, shouldn't patina only be for dials with lacquer intact? What do you think about this?
I mean, people are always going to be salesmen with what they're trying to sell. So I'm not, I'm not going to blame someone, but, I've seen things listed as tropical dials where it's just like the dial looks like it was completely submerged in water for a long time and it looks horrendous. And obviously the term spider dials has developed, and those are not appealing to me personally. The 80s Rolex watches with white gold surrounds where that's essentially all cracked. Very hard to sell those watches as well. So yeah, people have to try to come up with names for some of these things. I would still, in almost every case, rather have an original dial than a service dial when it comes to Rolex or other things. Prefer the originality, even if it has a lot of patina, even if it's cracked or the lacquer is damaged or other things. In some cases it can be very beautiful. I call those watches Rolex by God pieces, because it's like God, Mother Nature has changed the dial from how it looked in the factory, and it can sometimes be very beautiful.
All right, the very, very last question by my friend Thomas Burnett again. Who do you see as the most sought after brands for watches today in terms of collectability in the future? Do you think the market will side with the big independents or the usual suspects like Patek or Rolex?
It's a very interesting thing. We talked about this on episode 22 of Significant Watches, which just came out a few days ago. But the big transition, I think, over the last 2 years has been the rise of the independents. So that's been happening slowly, but really picked up speed, where Journe watches, some of them are selling for literally 10x plus where they were 5 years ago. I think of Tourbillon subscription, like I think in 2016 one sold for 162,000, and then more recently it's 2.9 million. So almost 20x increase in value of that watch in 5 years roughly. So that is one thing. First of all, they're being treated like living artists. FP Journe, Philippe Dufour, who I've met a number of times and love. I've met Journe as well. Roger Smith I've met, obviously huge demand. No one ever thought these kind of nerdy watchmakers would be seen as like the hottest things in the world of watches. But I think that's probably here to stay. George Daniels is obviously kind of one of the first independent watchmakers of the last 50 years. That's really kind of set the trend for independent watchmakers today, versus independent watchmakers 200 years ago, when everyone was an independent watchmaker, like Abraham Louis Breguet and all the other small watchmakers who were making their own products. Yeah, I think Rolex and Patek Philippe, I think he'll always be king in a sense, but I think these independents are probably here to stay too. Prices are stabilizing, I feel like, in some cases have decreased significantly. They were part of this whole hype and hysteria, some of these models, particularly Journe's, but they're definitely here to stay. And it's kind of that intersection of art and horology being treated like an artist, which is good for watches generally, for these things to be seen as art.
Yes, you do have a beautiful example of a platinum chronometre resonance with a brass movement on your page, which costs, of course, as much as a mansion in most parts of the US, except for crazy metropolitan areas, I guess, such as Los Angeles.
I got it from the original owner, and he paid $33,000 for it in December 2000. So he did well, but he did have to hold it for quite a while. So it's crazy.
So the very, very last question then, and I know it's the most difficult question, but since you said we have to define this term, and I always respect your academic focus, what would you say is a hype watch?
I think for me, a hype watch is something that is current production as a first criteria. And that goes back to my kind of talking about paying 10x or whatever retail on the secondary market for something being made now. It's a different story when it's out of production. You could then translate the three biggest hype watches, if you will, in terms of where we've seen values go skyrocket and also come down for certain models, would be the Patek Philippe Nautilus, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, and the Rolex Daytona. Three of the most recognizable watches, desirable watches in the world, all bracelet models, all talked about in rap videos, movies, etc. Um, but that's kind of the three models. Then you have brands like Richard Mille, which is generally, I would say, a lot of hype. Um, they make technically amazing watches, but they're part of that whole hype category. Journe has become a bit of that as well. Again, excellent watches, interesting history, um, but but kind of related to that. But really, I think it comes down to those three models and the current production models of those.
I think, one of the interesting things that you are highlighting in your balanced approach is it's not necessarily a dirty word. It's not necessarily an epithet to call something hype. But certainly there are cases where there is an oversized or outsized interest in certain watches that are current production models that are somewhat available, uh, but seem to command such uh, such an interest and such a demand for instant gratification that's perhaps in a way also fueled by social media, that you have these examples of watches that do have a certain important history, that are in certain cases very iconic designs, but still are chased after perhaps in a way that is not going to be eternal, that's not going to be timeless. And ultimately, there is always a correction, if not a certain downfall, especially when it comes, like you said, to watches that are still being produced, that are still available in some shape or form.
Absolutely. And, we saw every brand essentially try to create Royal Oak and Nautilus competitors the last few years as well. Laurent brands you would think would not, but like Chapek and Company, Laurent Ferrier, Parmigiani, Fleurier, everyone trying to create their own versions of these pieces, which is interesting.
Yeah, and
Even
not
longer
many of them.
with the Odysseus.
Right, and not many of them actually caught up, even though it has given, I think, at least to my taste, some interesting watches. It has produced some very intriguing designs, but none of them, except for Vacheron Constantin overseas, caught up in a significant way, I must say. Otherwise, of course, a lot of these brands that you mentioned have been rising steadily in terms of their profile, independent of their integrated bracelet sports watches.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Moser and their Streamliner. I mean, just a lot of brands I never thought would be coming out with watches like these.
Right. It's that's certainly a craze that I feel like is on really a downward trend. I don't know if it will catch up again, and certainly not in the same way if it ever does. I think more or less what I'm expecting, and this is a conversation that I would like to continue with you and others, is the return to certain lasting elements of design, and not necessarily limited to one period, right? The integrated bracelet designs of the 70s, I think that's a category that may well be exhausted by now, both culturally and in the context of a financial crisis.
Yeah, I agree.
Eric, once again, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. I hope we can continue this conversation in some shape or form. But thank you again for being so generous. Thank you again for fielding questions from my audience as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for the great questions as well.
All right, thank you, everyone, and once again, I will drop both of the links. Please go check out Wind Vintage. Again, one of the most artfully and knowledgeably curated collection of vintage watches. And also check out Significant Watches, which is a great podcast for pure watch talk. I think they have 20 some episodes by now, so you have a lot of good company that would last you more than a day at a time.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Eric, and thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.